Okay, at this point, it is my incredible privilege to introduce to you Ellen Nissenbaum, who works closely with many of us and is one of the most patient, available people we know to help us understand all of the different things we're trying to lobby on related to the economy, related to healthcare, related to Social Security, related to taxes, related to housing, employment, almost anything you can imagine. Ellen she's a senior vice president at the Center for Budget Policy Priorities here in Washington, and she is indeed known to many of us, and she is an incredibly good friend and a wonderful, wonderful teacher, and I welcome her to come up here and share some time with you.
Good morning, everybody. Well, I am not a shy or a quiet person, but I am so intimidated by that presentation. And meek is not me. Let me tell you, meek is not me, as my friends in the room know, but it is really a privilege to be here. I said to Marge, my blood pressure is rising as I listen to this presentation, and I'm usually the passionate one with the arms moving and my feet dancing, and so I'll do my best to be a very shallow second act to Dr. Dorian. But I actually think, although we've never met and talked, that our presentations are somewhat complementary. I, unfortunately, have the task of being the slightly more duller and drier one, but I'm hoping to take some information that I think lends some background and some other pieces for you to build on the case that you have just very powerfully heard. So notwithstanding the very early hour and the competition of the cherry blossoms, it's great to be here. I really want to commend you all for being here, for the work of the organizations. And my role in this work and this public policy, I wanted to tell you, in 1983, I worked for the Quaker group, and then I worked for an interfaith group on domestic hunger and poverty in the early 80s. And in 1983, our Center on Budget and Policy Priorities was asked by then Paul Kittless, who was running the United Church of Christ, to essentially staff what was the Emergency Campaign for Economic Justice. And that was really the beginning of the partnership between our Center on Budget and the faith community, and both the Christian and also the Judaic faith community and many other groups, to really imbue a moral voice into the really important policy decisions that were made. Now, I have to say, your timing is stunningly spectacular. Stunningly spectacular. It must have been Marge had some crystal ball that none of the rest of us had, because you have come at a time when it's the lull before the storm. You have come at a time when the Congress is gearing up to make some of the most important fiscal and, we would say, moral decisions of really the last 20 years. Those decisions will come later this fall, possibly early next year, and now is the time that we have to lay the foundation for the movement in the direction that Dr. Dorian has described and away from some of the choices that have been made very recently. So what I want to do to help you prepare for that is to step back and to talk about where we are as a country, kind of fiscally what's in front of us. Why did we get to where we are? Because if you don't understand that, you don't understand what are the most important things to think about when we make those decisions. And then I want to share with you our recommendations, kind of big picture, for how do we move forward in a way that addresses our fiscal challenges, again, based in ways that we help improve our society. Now, the Center's mission is not simply an analytic institution. Our mission is to reduce poverty and income inequality. So our work is founded in that fundamental mission of the organization. Now, one last word before we start. A lot of what I'm going to show you today are numbers, graphs, pictures. But I don't think of them as numbers and graphs and pictures. I think of them as telling a story about who we are as people, who we are as a country, and fundamentally, and how did you possibly steal my thunder line here, that budgets are moral documents. I'd like to talk about them as moral blueprints because they say exactly who we are, about our choices and our values, and I think it's really important to think about these in that framework. But let's start with a little bit of understanding of where we are. So, and I understand these are going to be available online afterwards, so, and I talk too fast, although I'm not even sure as I talk as fast as Dr. Dorian. So I am actually not going to apologize for talking fast, but I am going to whip through some of these pretty quickly. Okay, this is a picture of kind of our long-term fiscal outlook, and you only need to see one thing on this chart, and that is the mismatch between the current level of federal revenues, which is woefully inadequate, as Dr. Dorian himself noted, and the amount of spending that we have in our government for the really major areas. So you will see that the spending line is way above the revenue line. What we have come to understand, regardless of the party you're in, is that we have a serious fiscal challenge in front of us. We cannot, as a country, sustain the deficits and the debt that we have, and so we have to take action. Next slide, please. But if you listen to the popular rhetoric, and particularly the rhetoric of those running for election right now, you would think that all of the problem is because of runaway entitlements, and particularly because we spend too much on the poor. That's the rap, that spending is out of control. We have a fiscal problem. Fiscal does not mean low-income spending. Fiscal means budget and tax. And what stuns people is this chart, that virtually half of the cause of our debt comes from the tax cuts enacted in 2001 and 2003 and the wars. Now, the war spending is going to go down. The tax cuts, one of the single most important decisions to be made in the session after the election this year. Okay, next slide, please. Now, in order to think about where we have to tackle our deficit, we need to think about where do we spend our money and what are the things that we want to focus on. So here, I thought it might help to understand what is our federal budget. Where do we spend money? Well, what you can see from this is most money from the federal government is spent on popular and effective insurance programs, Social Security and Medicare, as well as on defense. That's virtually half of the budget. Now look at that tiny little sliver that says low-income discretionary programs, about 4% of our federal spending. Now what is discretionary? So let me just give you a little bit of budget glossary for 30 seconds. There are two kinds of spending in our federal government, or actually three kinds of spending we'll talk about. But when we think about programs, they're usually called entitlements or discretionary. An entitlement is if all of you became eligible for unemployment insurance, you would all get it, and the government would just pay whatever it costs. You are legally entitled as an individual to that benefit: unemployment insurance, food stamps, Social Security, Medicare, child nutrition, programs like that. Discretionary spending is just a fancy Washington word for funding that comes from the appropriations process, because the appropriators have the, get this, discretion, right, to set the funding levels every year. So WIC, Head Start, energy assistance, Meals on Wheels, transportation, environmental funding, cancer research, that's discretionary. So all of the programs in appropriations that help low-income people constitute a whopping 4% of our federal budget. Now, I want to note here that this chart, this pie chart, leaves out, as you will see, just to build a little suspense, the single biggest area of spending in the federal government. Back to that momentarily. Next slide, please. Now, the non-defense discretionary is the part of the appropriations part of the budget that you all care about. It's the domestic part, and it's the part that funds international assistance. And what I want you to look at is not the year-by-year changes here, but what this speaks to is a de-investment in our country in that part of the budget that funds the very things that you just heard about are critical to build the workforce. We're de-investing in education. We're de-investing in job training. We're de-investing in housing. That's what that line is going down. Now, there was a bump there, but that's really because of temporary spending as we responded to the economic recession. And yet, this is the area of spending that is under more pressure than any other, because members of Congress like to cut this area of spending. I'll come back and talk about why it's the look-ma, no-hands approach to budget cutting, widely used by both sides of the aisle. Now, next slide, please. One of the major whipping girls or boys lately is health care spending in the federal government. To hear it, you would think that Medicare and Medicaid were destroying the country and that we have to completely change them, in large part by eliminating the entitlement that our most vulnerable seniors, children, low-income families, and people with disabilities have. And yet the reality is our public programs are more efficient and more effective than private insurance. Health care costs are growing. Hands down, it is the single biggest factor driving our long-term fiscal problems. There's no question we have to make changes in these programs. But our health care costs are growing because we're aging as a society. The demographics push it that way, and because health technology and other costs are growing. So it's not because Medicare and you can go to the next slide, are a problem, but in fact, because we have a health care problem writ large, public and private, that we have to move forward to. Now, I want to make a small diversion here, and I was thrilled that you made a comment about this, Dr. Dorian, and that is that we are now seeing a stunning attack that I think reminds me of 1995 on what is now being termed the entitlement society. This is exactly that code language for the deserving and non-deserving that Dr. Dorian talked about a few minutes ago. This is a quote from a major candidate running for office on the Republican side. If we remain on current course, we'll have created a society that contains a sizable contingent of long-term jobless dependent on government benefits, on and on. There are 4 major attacks on the bedrock safety net that helps lift up and protect, as weakly as it does, the most vulnerable among us. That our low-income entitlements or entitlements are out of control from a budget perspective, that they're inefficient and ineffective, that they foster dependence and undermine work. And so the success or the recipe for how to fix all this, according to the people who made quotes like this, is the model that we did in welfare reform in 1996 and 1995, which is take the programs like TANF, like welfare, limit the amount of spending, send them to the federal government, and stand back and watch it do less and less and less to protect the most vulnerable children and families in our world. That is the prescription for going forward of what we should do to solve our budget problems. So let's take on those inaccurate myths. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at entitlements. Let's look at all entitlements. Well, 90% of benefits of those entitlements go to our elderly, our disabled, and many of them go to people who are low income and working. So the other 9 or 10% here goes for things like unemployment insurance, survivor's benefits, but the reality is that most entitlement benefits go to people who need them, and I think, frankly, who most Americans would argue should get the assistance they need. The next one, please. Now, the irony is that who is getting more entitlements than anybody else in the country? It's the middle class. That's largely from Social Security and Medicare. But here's a really important undercurrent around these attacks on entitlements. The narrative here is that the white middle class are being taxed excessively to help minorities and poor people who won't get off the couch and go to work and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. 64% of the population is white. They get 70% of the benefits from these entitlements. Now, there is one other kind of entitlement that we'll talk about shortly, and those are tax entitlements. And tax entitlements, you have 2/3 of those going to the richest fifth of Americans, and 25% of the benefits of those tax entitlements going to the richest 1% of Americans. Next slide, please. Now, inefficient and ineffective? Not really. Look at this. Look at the blue and the orange. The orange are the state administrative costs, the red is the federal administrative costs, and the blue are the benefit dollars. So contrary to the argument that bureaucracies, these programs are bureaucracies and dollars aren't getting to people in need, that is the exact opposite of the truth. And lastly, the next slide, is the tax expenditures. There's a very conservative economist named Marty Feldstein out of Chicago, highly regarded for his economic work. And Marty has been saying to people in the last year or so, the single biggest part of spending in the federal government is not Medicare and Social Security, it's within the tax code. And yes, as Dr. Dorian said, they're the little things like oil and gas and corporate jets, but the tax expenditures that are here that you can see swamp every other part of the budget are frankly things like the mortgage interest deduction, the charitable deduction, state and local, health exclusion. That's where the big dollars are. And those are widely supported by the American public. Now, one can argue about the way those are structured. One can argue the mortgage deduction is kind of upside down, but that's really where the money is. And what Marty Feldstein said is we should be looking at spending throughout the federal budget, whereas everybody else wants you to look at the blue bars and not the red bar. And we have to demand that if we're going to look at entitlement and federal government spending and we're going to hold them to a standard of well-targeted, efficient, and effective, you really have to start looking at the tax expenditures. Now, you have to put all of this into the context, so that's kind of a little bit of the fiscal outlook. Let's look at what's happening on poverty and inequality. Here I have only a little to add to Dr. Dorian, what he said, but let's move to the next one. One of the most tragic for me developments of the last 12 to 18 months is that our safety net responded in many critical ways to the recession. Millions of more people would have been poor were it not for programs like unemployment insurance, SNAP, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And because those programs grew so quickly to respond to the need, and because the need stays so high, they're now under attack for being too big and having grown too much in the last 2 years. So the wrap is the programs that did the best in responding to the recession and making sure more people didn't become poor are now all of a sudden the problem. It's a brilliant political twist to take those programs and now make them the enemy and the scapegoat. But what this shows you is that without those programs, our poverty levels would be much, much higher. The programs here that helped avert much more poverty in the recession were programs like unemployment insurance, SNAP, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, this is good that those programs helped mitigate the amount of poverty in recent years. And yet the safety net, as we know, is weak in very, very many ways. As I mentioned, a lot of the Republican candidates are talking about taking programs and building on the success of welfare reform, ending the entitlements and sending the programs to the states. Well, welfare reform wasn't such a success. And in fact, the TANF program is doing a pretty miserable job at reaching our poorest children and our poorest families. And the reality is the vast majority of poor children and poor families, because of welfare reform, now get no assistance from that program. On the next slide, I think it's often important for us to be able to talk about the strength of these programs and how well they've done. So look at the incredible numbers of millions of Americans that SNAP, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and unemployment insurance kept out of poverty in the last year during the recession. And this is the slide that I hope you will internalize in your brain. And if you say one thing to your members of Congress about this, I had never in my lifetime thought I would be using a World Bank statistic to talk to you about poverty in the United States. If I were to get up here and say, I want to talk to you about World Bank and that standard of extreme poverty where people live on $2 a day, you would be thinking I'd be talking about other countries, right? So look at the fact that we have doubled the number of children and households in this country that are living on less than $2 a day. Can you imagine that we have 1.5 million people in this country living at that amount? Now, this will come back, I hope, being something that we have burn in our brain and hold our policymakers accountable for, because one of the fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves about deficit reduction and budget choices is, do they deepen poverty and income inequality, or do they reduce poverty and try to have more equal distribution? Okay, on the next slide, I'm going to go very quickly. I think you've already heard some of this from the previous speaker, but this shows you visually, I think, what Dr. Dorian was trying to explain about income inequality. All you have to do is look at that red bar. That's the richest 1% of Americans. Their income grew nearly 300%, 277%, in the last number of years. So you can see, now just so you know, a family of 4 in that group has an income of more than $1 million. Now, let's turn to the decisions Congress has recently made and then move towards culminating this with the decisions in front of us. So on the next slide, you may all, I don't know why it does this on my slide, but if you could just put up all the bullets on the slide, that'd be great. So here's discretionary, again, fancy word for appropriations. I only want to draw your attention to 2 things on this slide. This is the agreement that was reached last summer when we were at risk of defaulting. It's called the Budget Control Act, and it basically cut $1 trillion out of appropriations in the next year, most of which, by the way, will come out of domestic and international spending, not defense. And it set up, that was the first thing it did, and then it set up a process to get another $1 trillion. That process was a committee, bipartisan, bicameral. It failed, and so where we stand as of this moment is we cut $1 trillion over the next decade in August just out of appropriations, and we've got coming next January a fancy word in Washington called sequestration, but next January there will be automatic cuts across spending with some programs that are exempt to bring us the other $1 trillion. And the the totality of that is $2 trillion of deficit reduction. Now, that automatic across-the-board cut is really a major, major focus of policymakers and advocates in Washington because of the magnitude of what would happen. It's about $100 billion next January. 50% is just from the Pentagon, and 50% is from domestic and international programs that are not protected. Now, speaking of protected, next slide, pat yourselves on the back here, and particularly pat your leaders on the back, because while those cuts across the board is not a way to enact public policy, it's not about making tough choices or moral choices, it's just an automatic cut across the board when you have failed as policymakers to make choices. But the good news is that low-income programs, by and large, are exempt. All the major low-income entitlement programs are exempt, and even a couple of smaller programs are exempt. So should those cuts take effect, right now, the low-income entitlement programs, but that still means a lot of programs funded by appropriations that provide relief here and relief abroad will be cut deeply. Next slide. Now, it's a little intense, this slide, but I actually think it's pretty important. What this shows you is that, in fact, over the last year and year and a half, we have done nothing but cut appropriated spending for domestic and international and some defense. This shows you three things. The yellow, which is labeled a CR, is simply a continuing resolution. That was the name of the appropriations bill in 2011. This shows you we made cuts already in 2011. Then the light blue is the $1 trillion of cuts that we've enacted over the next decade, and the dark blue is if the sequester takes effect, those are the additional cuts. Now, here's one thing for all of you. I imagine that you all are very strong advocates in your states for the choices being made at the local and state level. Maybe some of you work on your state budgets. Well, 1/3 of money that the appropriators spend on domestic appropriations is money for state and local governments. You all have some of the toughest fiscal conditions, and many of you are in states that have been slashing spending and raising taxes because you're having so much trouble. So one of the implications of the cuts in this area is to exacerbate the budget problems at your state level. The next one. Now, we had a joint committee that tried to work this fall to say, can't we come together as policymakers and make the tough choices? And they worked very hard to do that, but they ultimately failed. And I think it's hugely important to understand why they failed, to understand what's about to come. So the first point here is ratio of spending cuts to revenues. We've had major deficit reduction groups in the last 2 years come out with a series of recommendations of how to reduce the deficit. Every single one of those groups has said it will take tough spending cuts and new revenues. We can't just tax our way out of our fiscal problems. We can't just cut our way out of our fiscal problems. And the first group to come forward said for every dollar spending cuts, there should be $1 of new taxes. Pretty fair, right? That lasted about 3.5 seconds in Washington. Maybe 2.5. It quickly moved to President Obama's negotiations and a commission called the Bowles-Simpson Commission that was probably one of the more important deficit reduction commissions. And that commission and others have talked about, well, for every $1 of revenues, we really want $2 to $3 of spending cuts. So we're already moving up. At the worst moment in the Obama-Boehner negotiations this summer, a moment that we were compelled to call out on both of them, at one point in the negotiations, it was $5 or $6 of spending cuts for every $1 of revenues. The Joint Committee kind of played around with that $2, $3, $4. It is now viewed as kind of rational, reasonable, that the starting point for deficit reduction would be at least $2 or $3 of spending cuts for every $1 of revenues. So think about the path up. That's the starting point, not the ending point. Think about where that puts you. Now, Democrats wanted revenues. They were willing to make cuts in Medicaid and Medicare. Republicans did say they would put revenues on the table for deficit reduction on two conditions. The first is to make structural changes in Medicare and Medicaid that move us away from the kind of legal entitlement that we have now. And the second, which is increasingly becoming adopted by Democrats, is that in order to say, they'll say, yes, we have a deficit, we're going to do spending cuts, we're going to do revenues. But the price of revenues is to take the first amount of revenues we can raise from closing loopholes and cut everybody's income taxes. And then when there are revenues left over, then we'll also have, no, don't worry. We're going to have revenues for deficit reduction, but we want to reduce rates. So when you go in to see your members of Congress, ask them, Are they willing to cut the mortgage interest and the charitable and the oil and gas and all those things enough to ensure that we're going to have enough money to reduce income tax rates and reduce the deficit? You'll see their faces blanch pretty quickly. And one of the dangers of where this is headed is one of the most important things I want to communicate at the end of this session, which I'm getting too quickly. Okay, now, next slide, I'm going to move really fast. But we failed in the Joint Committee, we failed in a bunch of other, but the Congress has reduced the deficit. We actually have reduced the deficit by $2 trillion. Most economists and budget experts would say we need about $4 trillion over the next decade to stabilize our deficits and debt as part of our economy. So we've done about half of what we need to do. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. It was 100% spending cuts. 100% of what we have done to date came from spending, and within that, you can see at the bottom, half of that comes from domestic appropriations. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to really spend more than 2 seconds on the administration's budget. They've put it forward. Nobody's paying much attention to it. It cancels, it's a reasonable document. It cancels the upcoming sequester in January, the cuts across the board, by putting forward a balanced package of spending cuts and revenues, and it tries to present a model that we don't have to have this automatic axe coming down in January. We just need to make the tough choices. And that's the debate that is starting to gear up for the lame duck session. It doesn't cut discretionary spending any deeper. It does have Medicaid and Medicare cuts, but it preserves the structure of those programs. Now let me turn to the Ryan budget that was released this week. This is what I like to call my failure as a speaker slide. We bring in this brilliant woman from Harvard to train us, because I've done 5 presentations this week. We at the center do a lot of speaking. And Nancy came in, and she's a drama coach, and she said, 3 words on a page. Okay, 3 bullets with 3 words, but that's it. So I have failed in all of my trainings, but in my 28 years at the center, I can't get away from these kind. But this is really important. So the Ryan budget is probably one of the most extreme budgets I've seen in 28 years at the center, and certainly our director, Bob Greenstein, would say even beyond that. Massive tax cuts, and tax cuts that go beyond the Bush tax cuts of 2001. Remember, many Democrats supported those tax cuts, so we call them Bush, but in many ways they were bipartisan. Now, Medicaid and food stamps would be ended as you know them. They would be converted to block grants. Medicare would be converted to premium support. It effectively unravels and ends traditional Medicare the way we know it. Medicare for 65 and 66-year-olds is ended. Now, that might not be so bad if we had health insurance up and running, if the health exchanges were demonstrably affordable, but that's not quite where we are. So that's a real risk. Now, it does cancel the automatic cuts coming in January. That's the good news. Remember, those cuts are 50-50, 50% out of the Pentagon, 50%. It replaces them entirely with domestic cuts. Okay. And the last bullet is what I really, really want you to understand about the Ryan budget. So remember we cut $1 trillion. Remember I showed you that downward dotted line. Remember I talked about the de-investment. Well, for Ryan, driven by the Tea Party in the House, that's not good enough. So they take the $1 trillion that we cut in August for the next 10 years, and they cut another $1.2 trillion out of non-defense, non-military appropriations. And if you think about the automatic cuts coming in January, let's envision a world where they happen. The Ryan budget cuts domestic appropriations another $800 billion after the across-the-board cuts. So this would be the end of funding for low-income housing, for WIC, it would just be the end of that part of the budget. There's no other way to describe it. So let me just read to you briefly the conclusion of our Executive Director, Bob Greenstein, in the statement he released about the budget in toto. This budget would produce the largest redistribution of income from the bottom to the top in modern U.S. history. The increases in poverty and income inequality would be more than any other time in recent history and possibly in our nation's history. It would stand a core principle of the Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission report on its head that policymakers should reduce the deficit in a way that doesn't increase poverty or widen inequality. Specifically, the Ryan budget would impose extraordinary cuts in programs that serve as a lifeline for our nation's poorest and most vulnerable, and over time would cause tens of millions of Americans to lose their health insurance. So let's now wrap up and just spend the last 5 minutes on what's coming up. So the next slide, please. Well, the House is going to pass the budget resolution this week. There's no question about that. But the Senate is not going to do a budget, so we're really not going to have a big budget this year. That's probably not a bad thing. The Senate will vote on tax day on the so-called Buffett rule. This is the provision that's been put forward that ensures that millionaires pay some modicum minimal amount of their income for taxes. That's a purely political vote. It won't pass, but it will be enormously important to see which members of the Senate will support that vote. That's a very important vote for you all. And appropriations will now have this really bizarre world. So the Senate guys, on a bipartisan basis, are sticking with the deal of the summer. Those are painful enough bills to produce. The House is going to produce bills according to the Ryan budget and be cut much more deeply. None of those bills are likely to pass before the end of the fiscal year, which is the end of September. So all of the appropriations work is the real tough choices, and reconciling this difference between the Senate and the House will really be postponed until the fall. Now, there is one fiscal policy decision or one fiscal area that could see some action before the end of the year, and that has to do with that sequester. So now we're in a world where the joint committees failed, the sequester is law, and everybody is really panicked. Whether you work for the Pentagon, whether you work on environmental or WIC or housing, everybody's rightfully nervous. And so there are emerging proposals to change that. I like to call it rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because here's what they do. The most prevalent proposal is out there that initially at first blush seems great is a proposal put forward by Senator Kyle and a congressman in the House. It cancels the 2013 sequester. There's lots of reasons to cancel the 2013 sequester. The economy will be weak, unemployment will still be high, right? We're still at an economic very weak moment. But it doesn't just cancel it. It then cancels 2013 and for every year beyond that, because, by the way, when you do the sequester is for 9 years in a row. So if you have a sequester in 2012, 2013, unless they change the law, you have one each and every year for about $100 billion. So what Kyle does is shift the defense cuts to domestic cuts every year. So be very, very, very careful when policymakers say to you, we're going to take steps to avoid the cuts. Ask them how. Ask them what happens to the Pentagon and what happens to domestic appropriations. Okay, now, lame duck. Lame duck is the term that we use when we come back when the session of Congress is ended and they finish all the work. And every single major important decision is now gearing up for lame duck. And here's what they are. Will the Congress act to avoid the sequester? The omnibus appropriations, or wrapping up all the appropriations, will come together. The Bush tax cuts expire December 31st. What happens to those tax cuts? It's $4 or $5 trillion to extend them. If you let all of them expire, not a politically realistic prescription, but if you did that, you would have taken care of the overwhelming majority of our long-term deficit problem. You would have taken care of Social Security solvency, but that won't happen. But $800 billion of those tax cuts are for the richest Americans. Will we extend those tax cuts or not? Now, the debt limit, the amount of money our government is allowed to borrow, that's what almost brought us to a default in August. Unfortunately, it looks like the debt ceiling is going to have to be lifted again in November, and there's no better example of political hostage-taking than the debt ceiling, because what happened in August is that there were actual members of Congress willing to bring this government to its knees and risk default unless they got their way. And they got their way. They got their way with a budget deal that was 100% spending cuts, right? Okay. Now, you could see a bipartisan, bicameral, executive, legislative branch, serious negotiation that puts all these issues on the tables, makes the right choices, thinks through the ramifications, or not. And the not is where my bet tends to be, and that is that they come back for various reasons, and they say, you know what, it's been a long year, we'll just make these decisions next year. If the Republicans take the Senate, why would they negotiate a deal in the fall when they can do it better? If Obama loses, why would anybody on that side want to do something until next year when they have more control? And so there's a real question about when and how those decisions gets made. Well, let's wrap up in the last 3 or 4 slides with a couple of things to keep in mind as we go forward and as they go forward. So this just shows you that, in fact, the recent historical deficit reduction packages have included revenues, and in fact, the single most important and effective and sustainable deficit reduction deal we did in 1990 and 93 had significant revenues. So don't let anybody tell you that revenues, new revenues as part of deficit reduction is either unprecedented or somehow abnormal. The next one, if you could go to the next one, speaks to a point Dr. Dorian made. Everybody says we're this incredibly overtaxed country. Can you even find the red bar on the right? You have to look so hard. I mean, look where we are in the rankings of being taxed. Now, I know you'd like to stay, but let's move. Okay. The next one is, now, you know the rap, if we raise taxes, we're going to destroy jobs and we're going to hurt the economy, right? Wrong. Marge said it right. It's absolutely wrong. If you raise revenues the right way, there is no barrier to economic growth, okay? So don't let anybody tell you that. Okay, and let's wrap up at the end with kind of what the center's prescription would be for the right policy and the right moral choices going forward on our deficit reduction. So the first is, let's think about a balanced package. Let's listen to all those experts that said, we're going to have to make tough spending cuts. We are. We're going to have to do something about Medicaid and Medicare. We are. We're going to have to make some tough choices on Social Security. No question. But let's do that in a balanced way with revenues, with funding from the Pentagon. Let's be much more thoughtful and reasonable how we do that. There should not be any more cuts in non-defense discretionary appropriations. Period. End of sentence. You have to... You need to be able to talk to these policymakers about how much we've cut, and now we're cutting more. There is no reason to de-invest more in the very investments Dr. Dorian talked about for the kind of world and economic democracy we need. So we should not be cutting funding for this area of the budget anymore. We would recommend letting all the tax cuts expire at the end of the year. From the standpoint of the economy, you probably would end the tax cuts for the wealthy immediately, and maybe we would phase out the tax cuts for moderate income, middle income households, because the economy probably is too weak to do that in December. But that won't happen. That won't happen. So will we pay for the tax cuts we continue? Will we ensure that the high-income tax cuts expire? By the way, one of my biggest nightmares about lame duck, particularly on this kick the can scenario, where they say, let's just make all the decisions next year, we'll just pass a temporary law that delays the sequester, it extends the tax cuts, is that they also then extend all the tax cuts for the wealthy. If we extend those tax cuts by 24 hours into next year, we're done. It will be very difficult to pull those back. We should look at the tax subsidies. We've talked about health care. We have to make the right choices, but we want to make choices that look at health care costs overall, not just Medicare and Medicaid. We absolutely have to be loud and boisterous and brash about saying that programs like SNAP and Medicaid and Medicare, those structures are critical, those entitlements are absolutely essential, and we should not be doing anything that changes the structure of those programs. And then, of course, we think that we really ought to be asking that fundamental question, does this choice increase poverty and income inequality or go the other way? So let me sum up this way. We actually have two somewhat contradictory and conflicting economic challenges in front of us as a country. We have a short-term problem, we have long-term unemployment, we have budget gaps, we have holes in the programs we care about, we have high unemployment. So ideally, we have that problem, but we have this long-term fiscal problem. We have to get that long-term problem under control. For us as advocates for the poor and the weak, that long-term fiscal challenge undermines all of our goals for the kinds of investments and things we want to do. We'd ideally be spending money now, we'd be doing more stimulus, not going to happen. The debate has turned to a debate about cutting spending, about the undeserving, about programs that are out of control. Yes, there is some discussion now about revenues, and that's a big step forward. But the balance of the debate and the rhetoric is such that if we accept the contours of the current debate, we've lost this battle. So the language and the way we frame the problem and frame the choices is essential to our success in not allowing the discussion to be not whether we're cutting, but just what we're cutting, instead of what are the choices we're making, right? So we have to think about what's the language that policymakers want us to use, what is the understanding of the problem they want us to believe in order to address it. The fiscal debate is a debate now that will really position our country for decades to come, given the magnitude of the choices that we face. It's going to tell a story about our future. It's going to tell our story about economic security, and not just for the richest, but for the least among us. It's going to tell us whether we're committed to reducing poverty and income inequality. So Marge started the session by pointing to the title of your conference and asked, is this the fast you want? Is this the fast we want? So I'd like to leave you with a question, and I hope you'll ask your policymakers this question, and I hope you'll hold them accountable for the answer to this question. And that is this the budget we want? Are these the fiscal choices we want? Is this the fiscal future for our country that we want? And if we could demand that our policymakers answer that question and hold them accountable for those choices, we believe we might move a little bit in the direction that Dr. Dorian has laid out for us. Thank you.